So what we're discussing today, and the reason why we have Kieron, myself and Beverley on the call, is going through some of the feedback from the CERDAR directors or non-exec directors survey. There's been some really good insights that have come out of this one, so we thought we'd share the results in a webinar. And with me today, so maybe introduce myself first. So Tim Holmes, if you haven't met me before, head of sales based in Cape Town, although I happen to be in Nairobi for some business at the moment. And in the room, I have Beverley, Hancock, and Kieron. So Beverley, starting ladies first. Beverley is our head of the appoint division. So she is the one who finds the independent directors. So if you're struggling to find an independent director for your business, please get in touch with Beverley. She's had a long history of in the recruitment business, and there's certainly been finding some really special directors recently, some really good testimonials there. So thank you, Beverley, for all the work in that space. And I suppose this is, as much as anybody's, your survey, since you are placing directors. And Kieron is head of our guide division. So it's Kieron's division that takes the boards to the next level, supporting the boards to implement governance properly and to implement a board process properly and really make the board effective in what we'd call high performance. So I don't know who wants to go first. Who wants to just give us some sort of highlights? We will be sending some sort of summary slides to anyone that's registered for this call, which just has some summary of the information we'll be covering today. Maybe Bev, let's start with you, and particularly since this is your game, this is placing directors. What were the key sort of summary insights that you've picked up from this 2021 survey?
Thanks, Tim, and it's actually lovely to be chatting to everyone today, so thank you. Maybe we can start off by looking at, because we're really looking at how to improve Ebitda, what are the 3 ways to improve Ebitda as outlined in the 2021 annual Africa-wide non-executive director survey report? And bearing in mind, this is really focused on privately owned businesses and family-owned entities. So before I start diving into diversity, for example, maybe we can look at the 3 ways, Tim, if you're happy with that. And
sure,
starting with, to give that overview before we dive into things. And one of those is have more women on boards. And we'll chat through that shortly. But in terms of the stats that come through our findings, we've noted that 65% of boards have at least one female director, and that in our findings, and that these boards all report a high impact on company performance and increased Ebitda compared to the previous year. And when we look at ethnicity on boards, 71% of the companies with more than one ethnicity represented on the board have reported that the company's Ebitda has increased compared to the previous year. So, I think, and then I think third, we would then look at regular board evaluations, and Kieron's going to dive into that later, as well as to why and how. But there's 77% of businesses report that their board's impact on the business could be more effective. They have never conducted a formal board evaluation. Those that report that it could be more effective. So there's definitely some insights there to explore.
Yeah, no, some really interesting. I was surprised by the stats of how many boards now have women on them. I don't think we've never seen statistics that high before. So we'll get into that when we talk more about diversity. And Kieron, your sort of overview of the results?
Yeah, Tim, I think not too surprising. When one considers that there's a direct correlation between the performance of the board and the performance of the business. And if you're simply not conducting board evaluations on a regular basis, how do you know that your board is performing at the level that you would expect it to? So sadly, I don't think that this trend has improved too much in terms of the data over the number of years that we've been running the survey. And to the best of our knowledge, it is the only survey of its kind in Africa, focusing specifically on privately owned and family-owned businesses. Sadly, that trend hasn't changed much over the number of years. So either it's not a top priority for boards, or boards simply don't yet fully see and value what an evaluation can give you. So my overall assessment was not too surprising, but a disappointing stat nonetheless. If I were to wear the hat that you wear, the salesman's hat, then I'd go, what a great opportunity. So I suppose, it's a double-edged sword from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we just take a step back. I mean, we as a business were really struggling to get data on what was going on in private businesses. You can get reams of data on the listed companies, some of the larger corporates, but it's next to impossible to get proper data on what's happening in the boards of the private companies. So we're on, I think, this is the fourth survey, I think. And that was really, we launched it because we wanted to find out what's happening in private businesses, what's happening in family businesses, how are their boards constructed, what is the remuneration like? So a large part of this survey was about how much they're being paid. And we decided also, because that's our main focus, that we would only do this survey for Africa. And as you said earlier, Kieron, a really strong focus on family and privately held businesses. So yeah, I think that's where it's come from, is lack of data available. And now we're starting to, over a few years, starting to build a picture of what the landscape looks like. Excuse me. Yes, and board evaluations came out strongly that's not happening enough. Diversity was a big issue, seems to be improving now. So maybe that's a good segue into talking a little bit more about diversity, Bev. What have you seen as being the typical diversity in boards, and where could things be improved?
So I think a lot of what I've seen over the last year in discussions with businesses and discussion with boards and in appointments has been reflected certainly in some of the findings when we talk about typical diversity. And, today I'm going to talk about typical diversity, where we look at gender, at ethnicity, we look at age, for example, and then almost reaching above and beyond, which I think we need to start looking at diversity of thought as well. So we'll segue into that, I think. But certainly, if we look at typical diversity, and what does this report highlight? I mean, I'm really pleased to say that in terms of female representation in the boardroom, we've now got 40% of board members being female, and this is definitely up on the 23% that we saw last year.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think the year prior to that was also sitting in the early 20s. So there's definitely an increase in terms of women in the board. And if we take out of that, I think the findings, we can say that 65% of boards have at least one female director, those in the survey. And all of these boards or these boards are reporting higher impact on company performance and increased Ebitda compared to the previous year. So there's definitely an impact. And the same goes in terms of diversity around ethnicity. So there has been an improvement in the year prior. So there's been a 5% increase in terms of number of board members. So we're looking now at 46% of boards having only having one ethnicity represented, and only 16% of boards having, 3 or more ethnicities represented. But the reality around this is, once again, we're talking about diversity of thought, diversity of perceptions and ideas and values and ads, etc. And we are seeing these same boards and companies reporting a higher Ebitda and overall board impact on the business. So that's really, really strong. And the same goes in terms, I think if we look at age, because that's probably another typical number to look at, we're still seeing that the majority of board members are aged between 45 and 59, but there's definitely an increase in terms of the proportion of members that are now 35 to 44 years old. And there's naturally a lot of reason around that: technology, understanding of the markets today, social understanding, social networking, and online presence, etc. So that we can see that difference.
Yes, I mean the gender and ethnicity is a relatively easy thing to pick up in a survey, but I mean, I know from personal experience, having that diversity of thought in the boardroom makes a huge difference, and diversity of age. So we definitely have way too many people like me in their 50s with grey hair in boardrooms. We need to spread that age down to younger because of technology coming in. A lot of businesses are being massively disrupted by technology, yet we've got 50, 60, 70-year-old people in the boardroom. It just doesn't make any sense. And diversity of thought, I think, is a big thing. So from your experience, what have you seen as being, or if you have seen any shifts in terms of diversity of thought, what does that look like practically?
So something, I mean, I've been talking about diversity of thought for a while, and our learned colleague Roger speaks to it as cognitive diversity. Because whilst we're addressing gender, we're addressing race, we're understanding that age is also making an impact and has a huge impact, incorporating new perspectives into the boardroom, generating learning for everyone within a boardroom. The same as looking at nationalities. If you're looking to expand your business and expand in a different territory, have you got someone on the board who can add value and depth in terms of understanding about that location, that locality, from marketing, financials, legalities, etc. So I think when we look at leveraging our learnings, we look a lot at gender, we look at a lot at race, but we need to extend to include this diversity of thought, of education, of experience. Especially when we see a lot of businesses nowadays, their customer base is changing. So in the past where it was very much a male-dominated sector, for example, cars is one. We're now seeing the customer base changing to that of being, moving into young female, for example. So to have an understanding of and bring an understanding of that diversity and that changing customer base. And I think when we look at the diversity of thought, we're moving from identity diversity to this cognitive diversity. So we're aligning this thinking and what else do we bring to the table with the key competencies that are still required for that boardroom and in that individual to facilitate these diverse conversations and to facilitate really effective decision-making moving forward.
And if we get sort of really practical and very specific, what do you see as being the key benefits of having females on the board? So this is for all of the men on this call. This is real value, and share with us what that means in practical terms, sitting around a board
all
table.
that testosterone that sits in a boardroom, and great thinking and bouncing ideas. Well, there's a reality to this, and there's a reality why having a female in the boardroom or females in the boardroom does make a difference. And first of all, women do bring a different perception, a new perspective, should I say. We bring a larger range of the softer personal skills, so an understanding and empathy, the listening skills, the ability to communicate fairly effectively. A lot of the time, where it might be groupthink or everyone's sort of, yes, let's do this. Women tend to ask, and I'm sure many men will disagree or agree actually in the home, is women tend to ask the tough questions. So, we're not afraid to actually ask the hard question and not necessarily go with the flow. And bring the discussions forward. And this has all been found in studies, and numerous studies across Europe and the States. Females tend to be more forward thinking and strategic in their decision making as well. So, and as I say, I mentioned earlier, with customer bases changing so much, one has to ask oneself, do we have that deeper understanding of our customer bases in the boardroom?
Yes, I think that customer base aspect is critical. I mean, I was actually mentioned it in a call earlier this week. What businesses only have 50-something-year-old white males as their customers? So why don't you have women on boards? Why don't you have different ethnicities on your board? Why don't you have different age groups on your board that talk a lot more to the realities of your business and your customer base? it makes sense. Yes, no, you can't have 20 people on your board to cover everything, and it's not supposed to be the, I can't think what the name of the committee is, but there's a committee where you have to have every representation on it. It's not supposed to be like that, but it needs to at least have a little bit of diversity of thinking. And then the other piece is obviously the youth. So in the recent results you've looked at, there's not that many people bringing younger people onto boards. What have you seen as being the key benefits of doing that?
You know, I think there's still that concern around the depth of experience needed, for example. But there's a reality in what we need to look at. And I think certainly how SADAR looks at board appointments is we often take that deep dive in terms of the role scoping and often the board appointment diagnostic that we do. And there you've actually got to first determine the optimal board composition. So look at your longer term strategy and the skills needed. And often there you're going to start looking at technologies about how, when we're diversifying, what do we need to be doing? You know, even in the manufacturing space, are we old school or are we moving forward? You know, and for the businesses that are operating online a lot more, it's what do we have? So it's about that thinking and that process and bringing, as I said, those new perspectives in. So it's being able to consider what is needed and then also assessing your current board composition and really looking at the skills and attributes of each director and looking at what are the gaps and looking to fill those gaps. And so why, and you know, we are seeing a lot of experience coming through and new perspectives coming through from younger board members where they're bringing a different point of view to the table. And once again, that diversity in terms of discussion.
Yeah, and I think that the big one is obviously technology because they've lived it, they've grown up with it, born with it. Whereas those of us who only got a cell phone when we were in our 30s or 20s or whatever, it's a different game, completely different game. Thanks, Bev. And then board evaluations, Kieron, what have you seen in terms of take up? Well, you mentioned it briefly earlier, and also the value. What is the impact of it?
So Tim, I think the first answer or the first part of your question is we are seeing a stronger focus on regular board evaluations in some parts of Africa and in some sectors of the economy, so the banking and the insurance sectors. The regulators are insisting on, if not annual, then at the very least biannual board evaluations. But again, that's a demand being driven by regulation as opposed to intention. I think the second part to your question is in terms of how a board evaluation typically supports increasing Ebitda. It doesn't. Now that might sound like an odd way to answer the question, but the important thing here is that simply conducting the board evaluation is not going to make any difference. It's what you actually choose to do with what emerges from the evaluation that's absolutely important. So when you look at it from that perspective, the departure point with a board evaluation, one, it should not be a tick box exercise. The minute that you're doing it for a tick box exercise, it is going to make no difference to the bottom line or the Ebitda or any other number in the business for that matter. Secondly, you have to approach it from the point of view that the intention behind doing the board evaluation is looking for ways as a board in order to improve ourselves. It's not a judgment. It's not a report card on the individuals on the board. Because again, that's the easiest thing in the world to do, is just to, draw up a report card and write a few notes at the bottom and say, thank you very much, we've done the evaluation. So if you approach it from the point of view of what are the areas that we need to improve, and I can certainly talk a little bit about what typically emerges through the board evaluations. If that's your departure point, then it's going to make a difference to your EBITDA. I think the third thing, and this is often the most, or the most important aspect of it, in particular with family-owned and privately owned business, is that the board evaluation should ultimately seek to give the board, or show the board, or outline for the board where the balance sits between what is good, accepted, best practice corporate governance versus what works for us as an organization. Because that's absolutely critically important. There's no point doing a board evaluation, coming along with a whole lot of governance and policy and everything else, and you completely stifle the entrepreneurial nature of the business. And at the same time, that you don't just allow the entrepreneurial nature to fly in the face of good practice from a corporate governance point of view. So I think, to answer your question, number one, you have to be intentional about it. You have to approach it from the point of view of saying, how do we identify areas where we can improve, and specifically improve on finding that balance between good governance and what works for us as an organization.
Yeah, some good points there. I was just thinking, for those who've never done well, maybe we could just do a very quick poll of the people who are on the call. Who does or has done an annual board evaluation on this call? Just put in the chat box, yes, or every time, or whatever is appropriate. So we've got one nope, one yes. Once annually. Yes, okay, well, good, it's looking good. Never done? Okay, we've got, so Luke, you're not on your own. There's someone else on here that's never done. Excellent. So we've got a blend. So we've got 3 or 4 who haven't done one. So in your experience, what's the resistance to doing a board evaluation, Kieron?
Before I answer that, I see there's a question in the Q&A that from Siaporo, which I think is also a relevant question in here. It says, what is the best way to do a board evaluation? Should we do it ourselves as board members, or hire an external company to do the evaluation? I guess my answer to that would be, that's the same reason why you don't mark your own homework or your own exams when you write them when you're at university or at school. But let me answer the question in a little bit more detail before we go into that. First of all, I believe it's important that you conduct the board evaluation on both a qualitative and quantitative basis. Because purely doing it on a quantitative basis gives you great content, but it gives you no context. And in my experience, most boards make decisions and operate with context, with more context than they do with content a lot of the time. So whilst the numbers may say one thing, the context may be completely different. So I think it's important that you get a blend of perspectives, content and context, so qualitative and quantitative. And yes, the answer to the question is, ideally, have it conducted by an external third party, because that way there is no subjectivity or anything else from that perspective. Tim, and I must confess, I forgot what the second part of the original question was.
Well, one of the original questions, which I think was, how do you practically do it? But the first one was what was resistance to doing it? I mean, it's a bit difficult to answer those on the call to what their resistance was. If you feel like typing the paragraph, then that would be very helpful. But yeah, it's obviously a common problem. The survey, nowhere close to everybody does a board evaluation. On this call, nowhere close to everybody has done a board evaluation. What, in your experience, has been the hold up or the holdback? Why aren't they doing it?
I think the the easier or the simplest answer to that is it's not high on the agenda to self-evaluate. I think sometimes boards measure themselves only by the company's performance, and that is certainly a great measure of how well the board is doing. I mentioned earlier, a well-performing organization there is a correlation with a high-performing board. So, often the resistance is simply we just don't put our attention on self-evaluation as part of our board process. And I think that this is the, when you talk about what do we do in an evaluation, is fundamentally what we want to look at is, does the board have a methodology that it follows, which includes evaluation and improvement? Because if we don't specifically put it on our agenda to do as a board, it never gets done. The really interesting thing that I find when I run board evaluations and I present feedback is 99% of the time, the content of the feedback and the report is not new. We all know it. It's stuff that has been spoken about, but it never gets written down. And sometimes the most valuable part of doing a board evaluation, other than identifying areas where we can improve, is just getting some of the stuff written down. Because if it's written down, my dad always used to say, if it's not written, it's not true. But more importantly, if it's written down, at least it gives us something to focus on and to put our attention. Otherwise, it's just conversations that happen around the boardroom table. They may or may not be minuted, so that they never get done.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point you mentioned earlier, and I see that Belelwa, thank you, Belelwa, for your honesty. And it is uncomfortable, especially when some board members do not prepare, and then do not appreciate being evaluated. Everybody in the boardroom knows who's not prepared regularly. Everyone in the boardroom knows who's not engaging at the level they should or has gaps in their knowledge. We all know that. As you said, there's rarely any surprises in a board evaluation. But unless you go through a process and write it all down and work through it and say, look, we need to train everybody in this because we've got a big hole here, or please, let's draw up the board charter and make sure that everybody buys into the fact that they're supposed to prepare, that the board meeting papers are supposed to come out with enough time to prepare, etc., etc. We're not going to be able to move forward. So why would you want to cover it up when actually everyone knows what the problems are? They're just not actually dealing with them, not actually addressing them. So we're very good as companies at doing all these evaluations for our team, but then as soon as it gets to board level or senior management level for that matter, I suppose that's maybe where it starts. We don't want to be told what to do. I mean, so many entrepreneurs, so this is private and family businesses, so many entrepreneurs have told me, I became an entrepreneur because I didn't want someone to tell me what to do. So now you've got a board who's effectively evaluating them, telling what to do. So I understand where there is definitely that discomfort in terms of the evaluation process. But if you're going to have a board and you've already got a board, that's part of the value of the board, is to do those kind of evaluations and move forward and do things better.
Yeah, and I think, and part of what you're saying there is so very true. And I think it's a shift in mindset and a shift in language that's required as well. Is that if your reluctance to put a board in place is, I don't want somebody to tell me what to do, that board is never going to work. If your departure point is, I would like somebody to help me to understand better what to do, that's far more important than having the point of view of, I don't need somebody to tell me what to do, because guaranteed that board will fail.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yes, absolutely. Bev, we haven't spoken about direct remuneration. That's what this main survey was driven by. So Bev, do you want to give us an overview of what the results said about how much directors get paid? And I've just had a conversation this morning about setting up a board, and they were all astounded how cost-effective directors are, because that's a common misconception in the markets, that directors are really expensive. So what did the survey say, Bev?
Absolutely, Tim. I couldn't have said it better. There's often this, when we look at companies that are looking to set up and formalize a board, one of the fears is often the fact that I can't afford non-executive or independent directors. And on the opposite end, you have these established boards where often there's not clarity around the earnings, or you've got earnings that are higher, much higher than one would think. So it really is important to look at director fees. And we're always happy to we do director fee recommendations, because it is about understanding your business and your board and what are director fees that are relevant to the area. And I think from this report, we see that fees continue to be driven by turnover and by the company size. And that's for both independent directors and for non-executive directors. So that's still very, very clear in that space. And we do find that fees are much higher in Southern Africa versus Western East Africa. But I think typically, and this is from the report, we find that independent or independent directors are now earning, so 25% of directors are earning between $5,000 and $10,000 and probably around 20% are earning more than $10,000 per annum. Now that is very much based once again on company turnover and the size of the company. But one interesting finding is that independent directors are now earning higher fees than non-executives. So that's been a shift in the last year.
Yes, I was fascinated by that. Well, as an independent director, I was quite relieved by that because the $5,000 is not very high. So in your space, appointing directors, are you seeing that if someone has got decent amount of director experience, has taken the time to do some education, some kind of training, and they're an independent director, are they in sort of more in the 10,000 bracket, or are they still stuck in the $5,000 bracket?
No, it really does. It really depends. I think director fees come down to what you are looking for. So, and it's not about how well known someone is or etc. It's about what are the skills and experience that I'm looking for. What is my company size? And all of these line up to going, this is the X amount. So we've definitely seen a shift in the last 3 years of director fees. So they're higher than before. And I think, Tim, you would have seen this yourself in terms of just general engagement with businesses and boards. So definitely there's a shift up and a shift to a fair fee for your contribution. And we also need to look at how many board meetings you are having a year, how many committee meetings you are having a year, how long are those meetings. So a lot of factors do come into play, and that definitely impacts what that fee will be at the end of the day.
Yeah, I've seen a willingness, or not so much a willingness, but more a realization that there is significant value of independent directors, and therefore they should be commanding higher fees than whatever that is, 6,000 Rand a month. Because that's, if we put it in realistic terms, that's what you're paying an intern. So if your director's not adding more value than an intern, then they're probably the wrong director. But there seems to be a better acceptance of getting towards more like 20, 30,000 Rand a month. I think I had one position not that long ago, which was $30,000 a year, which was definitely much more in the space of, I'm going to commit to this because I feel like I'm being rewarded and recognized for my value, rather than paying me peanuts and then I'm going to take shortcuts or just not be fully committed. So and I think often boards don't pay someone anything, particularly NGOs. But my, I suppose, request when people are looking at putting directors on their board, at least pay them something, at least pay their expenses, at least feel like their contribution is worthwhile, because it's really difficult to keep that engagement if there's zero value for you, and you're paying for all this money for petrol, you're paying for flights, whatever you're doing, and you're getting nothing back, it can get a bit difficult to keep it going for long periods of time. So yes,
and you're never off duty. You're as a
no,
director,
you're never
you're
off
not
duty. There's 24/7 job for 6,000 for nothing at all, or 500 rand a month or something. It's ridiculous.
And you picked up a good point there in terms of being paid monthly. And I think that's something that we do encourage, because even if you have got a quarterly board meeting, and we should really be looking at bi-monthly, every second month or month, but in terms of sort of driving a business forward. But even if you have quarterly board meetings, as we mentioned, directors are not off duty. So it is quite nice to structure your fees to be monthly, ideally,
Thanks, Bev. And Kieron, what have you seen as the value? So sitting in boards with companies, listening to their minutes, or listening to their recordings, reading their minutes, what have you seen as being particular value adds of having independent directors?
And in particular, independent non-executive directors.
Yes.
And sometimes the terms get a little bit confused. Actually, I was having a conversation with somebody in Senegal yesterday on exactly this point. And the point is, quite simply put, independent non-execs have the ability to be completely objective. And if you're going to get real value, then that objectivity is absolutely crucial. As an independent non-exec, you're not coming to the boardroom table with anything other than the interests of the company at the top of your agenda. And ultimately, that is what the responsibility of a director is about, to make decisions that are in the best interests of the company. Yes, it's good to have a blend of executives on that board as well, because they have reality for what's going on in the coalface. But your independence can really bring a completely objective, fresh, non-biased or whatever perspective into the business. And that's really where I see the value.
Yeah, definitely. There was a couple of comments in here. So thank you, Canyu. And no board member would be pleased to know they're being benchmarked against an intern. I would have said there was even more of a incentive to actually do the job so that you get benchmarked well in your board evaluation. But yes, what typically happens is they resist the board evaluation like crazy. And I've seen that before. And we've struggled to get them to resolve to do a board evaluation because there's a number of members who really know that they are not doing what they're supposed to do, and the last thing they want to see is see it written down. What is the best way to get board members? Should it be CEO proposing names and voting AGM? Bev, yours. Should we give you that one?
Absolutely. So in the past, a lot, and it's still ongoing, you'll have referrals. So-and-so knows Joe Bloggs, who's great on another board and would be great on your board, for example, or you're looking in your immediate network of professionals, etc. And the danger with that is that you're not defining what you really need, first of all, and then using that as the benchmark to go out. So not scoping a role properly and then going out. So first of all, define the scope or scope the role, and that looks at what values the board has and what you're looking for. It looks at the key competencies. Do they need to understand governance? What is the sector, if there's a specific sector? Although it's not really important to have the industry knowledge always, because the specialists sit around the room. What is the expertise? What is the abilities that we need? And then you look at what is the profile? How does my board operate at the moment? How is the decision-making driven? What do we do? How do we balance that board to be more effective? And then you go, this is the scope, this is the profile, and use that to go out into the market. Now, absolutely, you can use your existing network, you can reach out, you can ask for referrals. But what is very useful is to use a professional services company that actually understands board and understands non-executive directors and how to present the non-executive directors that are best suited, or independent non-executive directors that are best suited to your board for all those reasons.
So just want to pause there, Bev, because I think it's critical with your experience. Most of us are used to dealing with recruitment consultants who appoint employees and even senior executives. What have you found the difference being from working in that executive recruitment space to now in the director recruitment space? What is the difference between the way you approach the search or approach the problem, as it were?
Yeah, and a good question that. So we don't start with a CV, and you don't start with being given a spec, essentially. You know, very much this is about a progression of understanding the board, understanding the key needs, working with the board to define the non-executive directors that are best suited to that board. And that's on multiple levels, as we mentioned before, in terms of how do we balance that board? What do we need to, what are the abilities, the experience, the expertise, and so forth, the values to actually add value to the board in the long term. And that takes it up another level. You're not just being given a spec and I'm looking for someone with legal who understands the legalities, because that can be anyone, you know. And so I think that's very, very important. And also to have the network of in Africa or in South Africa and so forth, to be able to approach the people are going to make a difference.
Yeah, I was thinking about a conversation I had also in the last couple of weeks about that if you're going to be on the board, you need to be able to think strategically, bigger picture, see the future. And we had one company we were working with where the financial manager or a financial director, it's very confusing when you say financial director, so let's stick to financial manager, who is a director, who had lots of management experience, an amazing amount of experience about putting together the reports and all of the systems that ran the finances of the company. But putting him into a board context really, really battled with the looking forward. I mean, if you think you've spent 20 or 30 years of your life as an accountant looking backwards, to now be told, no, you've got to do a projection for the next 6 to 12 months. Maybe you'll get a cash flow projection if you're lucky, but to actually make proper management accounts decisions and thinking about what not even just the budget, but what is the thinking about the financial structure of this business over the next 6 to 12 months was really tough. So I think that's also the big distinction between being able to serve well in a management context and serve well on a board. You have to shift that focus to look forward all the time and think about strategy all the time, not just look at what's happened in the past. Use what's happened in the past as your foundation, but it's the way you're looking at a problem is what's going to happen in the future.
I was going to mention that that's a very good point, because that comes a lot down to understanding your profile. And this is when you are looking for a board position and when you are looking to fill a board position. And that is understanding, what am I really looking for? So we use contribution compass profiling. It's a team profiling, individual profiling tool. But what it does is it looks at, how do I make decisions? So you can look at as board, how do we make decisions? How do we drive? What energies do we need to bring into a room? You know, do we need someone that's going to be flying out with the ideas and thinking strategically? Do we need someone who actually is going to ask the hard questions and want the detail? So those are things. And so it's about understanding, A, what we need on the board. And also when you are looking at a board position, understanding what you bring to the board. And that's when we start marrying the two together.
I was just thinking, Kieron, in your as almost the receiving end of good and bad boards, and it's maybe a difficult question. So if you say I don't have any examples, that's absolutely fine. But can you think of an example of where having the right people around the room has made a big difference, and having the wrong people in the room has made a negative difference.
Yeah, I don't know that I can necessarily point to specifics, not without incriminating myself or giving away some confidentialities. But again, I think ultimately you see it reflected in the performance of the board, or you see it in the performance of the organization. That's perhaps a simplistic way of looking at it, or positioning. But I think, and if you were to maybe take it a step further, what is the quality of decision making that is coming out of that board, and what is the impact of that decision making on the business itself? And I think that that's often perhaps an indication of where you have the right or the wrong people on the board. Again, the right mix of skills, the right ethnicity, independence, etc., etc. I find that when you work with a board that is, to all intents and purposes, just a board made up of shareholders, well, guess what the decision making is that comes out of that board? It's more often than not in the best interests of the shareholders, as opposed to what are in the best interests of the business or the company, for that matter. I'm not saying that's always the case, but I've worked with several boards or evaluated several boards where that entire board is made up of only shareholders, and you can see it not necessarily in the results of the business itself, but when you talk to the executives in the business who are also on the board and who also happen to be shareholders, you see that permeating right through the decision making and down into the low levels in the organization.
Yeah, and particularly the stats that we got back about the importance of independent directors were really interesting. That how many companies had independent directors, but how the behavior or the way they engaged was significantly different just by the fact that they had different. Have you got the numbers there?
Sorry, Tim, was that to me?
Yes, sorry. So that was that value drivers, that only 25% of boardroom composition was represented by independent directors. I mean, it's not a very high number, but the impact that it had, if you did have the independent directors, was quite impressive.
Correct. And again, to Bev's point, is that if you have the right independent directors around that table, because again, so often you'll see that, oh, well, I'm going to put a board together, so I'll get 3 of my mates together. We'll get together on a Friday afternoon, sit around the boardroom table, drink beers and eat biltong, and that'll be our board meeting because now I've got a board. That's not going to get you the results that you want. So again, for me, it has to be intentional and it has to be thought out.
Yeah. I mean, just looking at this stats here, found that independent directors are significantly more likely than boards without an independent director to attend formal director training. I mean, 76 versus 39%. But why should just having an independent director make that much difference? It just boggles the mind. But I guess it's because that board is much more focused on learning and developing and doing things better. Whereas if they don't have any independence at all, as we've talked at length, I think earlier, it tends to be we carry on doing things the way we do things. And we're not looking to evaluate, or we're not looking to do things in a different way or challenge each other or whatever it might be. And the fact that 88% of respondents said that if they had a choice, the last person they would replace is the independent director is also quite telling. Because if they weren't adding value, that's an easy person to remove from your board, because you've just have a shareholders meeting and say, cheers, thanks very much, we no longer need you. But the fact that, yeah, pretty much everybody wanted to keep them, they must be doing something right.
Exactly.
And the last 12% may be the ones that got the wrong independent director. We don't know.
Yeah.
So Bev, we've talked at length about independent directors. So someone who's aspiring to be a director or wants to improve themselves, what are the main things that they should do to try and give them a best chance of serving on boards? And then maybe we can just do a quick check-in to see who on this call is actually an aspiring director.
So, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think there's 3 key areas. And that is to really understand your profile. The second would be your networking. And your third would be the self-development. So if we're looking at your profile, that goes back to a lot what we were saying earlier, understanding what do you really bring to the boardroom table. You know, your bio, your CV is not what makes you a director. You need to understand what your areas of strength are, the expertise, the abilities, the skills that you have, your values, because you know you can also choose what board you want to be on. It's not just someone looking at you, and what energy you bring to the boardroom. So how do I balance? If I walk into a boardroom and I'm working in that board, how does that board operate? You know, do I bring that value? So understand that about yourself. Then go, okay, I want to be a board member. I want to be a non-executive, or I want more positions. And look at your network. How am I talking to my network? How am I expanding my network? And what is my LinkedIn profile, say, for example? So to start generating that flow in that process. And the third, as I mentioned, is self-development. Now, there's a lot of free webinars, free workshops, etc., that really focus on the board and at director level, because no one teaches you how to be a director when you start off. You know, you open up a company, you're a director. You know, someone says, come sit on my board, you'd be fantastic, you're a director. But you really don't understand what is a director. And so it is about the learnings. And whether it's a one-day workshop, like a high-performance board workshop, or a real practical, detailed director program like the Applied Director Program, it's about taking yourself on that journey. And it's not only directors that are people that are aspiring to be a board member, because I have sat with and spoken to highly experienced chairs and board members who have walked away with learnings. And there's such value in that, because we can all learn and grow and improve ourselves in that space.
Yeah, definitely. In meetings recently, you've had some really good experience shares of what difference attending something like the Applied Directorship Program makes, and how you think differently, and the approach and the questions you ask is different, and other board members saying, well, what have you done? Where have you been? Because you're approaching the board meeting in a completely different way. You're definitely more prepared. You're asking much deeper questions. And that definitely comes from that confidence and that full understanding of how to operate in that space. I'm just going to post on, we're keen to get other people to obviously complete the survey for 2022. So I'm just going to put the link there, and we'll also send it out to everybody afterwards. Any closing thing on how interested parties can participate in the survey, Kieron?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the easiest way to participate in the survey is to click on the link and complete it. But of course, you know, please feel free to get hold of us as well, and have a conversation with us if you have any specific thoughts or additional insights. I think it's always good to get additional thoughts and ideas onto the table where we may not have seen something or spotted something. But yeah, step number one is please, you know, download the report if you haven't already, and then complete the link for next year's survey. The more
Yeah, and
information
also,
we have, the more valuable.
and it's also if you've got friends or people who you know that are on, I'll come back to your question now, Beverley. If you've got friends who are on boards, particularly in private and family businesses, then please share the survey link with them, because the more companies we get completing the survey, the more accurate the results we get, and the more conclusions we can take from what comes out of it. Whereas, like any data, if it's a fairly small representation, can you really believe it? Can you rely on it? So the broader the number of people who complete the survey, the better. I'm just going to put this up, so if there's anything you'd like to do to follow up, if you want some more interested in our applied directorship program, if you put on call me by a free consult, we'll get in touch with you, and obviously that applies to Kieron, myself, or Bev. If you'd like a 30-minute consult for free on our particular areas of interest. And then below where you said, what's the rationale of focusing on family-owned and businesses and private businesses as well? It's primarily because of our founder, Carl Bates's interest in family businesses, but I think we've kept it going, and even when I joined in 2013, there was never a question of us moving away from that as our foundation, because we were really passionate about trying to save businesses from failing for dumb reasons because they hadn't put proper governance in place, or to get the businesses in a position where they were actually growing and developing to their full potential, because too often they're being held back by the founders or held back by individuals. So if we get it right in that space, it's so much easier to translate the training, translate the learnings into the corporates and the not-for-profits and government committees and all the rest of it. So it's not that we don't work with other organizations, but we focused our learning and development as our specialization is on family businesses. And because they are a different animal, they need more mentoring, they're slower to get into this governance because they don't see the value initially. It's not regulated that they have governance, but it can add massive value if you get it right. And we've got so many clients we've worked with who look back and go, why on earth didn't we do this 10 years ago, 20 years ago? It's a very common refrain. So rather than wait for another 20 years, I suppose my call for action is to make a decision earlier and quicker and get on with it and get it done. Any other closing comments from you, Bev?
Not really. I think, today has really been looking at how do we increase Ebitda, and it's been a really great conversation about what do we need to do. What are the areas that are very clear, and what we need to be doing in order to both improve our company performance and our board performance, as well as in the long term looking at increasing Ebitda. And it's valuable to look at diversity. It's valuable to look at your fees. It's valuable to do your evaluations, your board evaluations.
Yeah, so if nothing else from this session, try to look at the diversity of your board and make some plans and proper decisions about expanding the diversity. Do a board evaluation. Even if it's just once, do a board evaluation. And then certainly think about independent directors. All of the boards I've been on where I've come in as independent director, you can instantly see the value and know they shouldn't be from your industry. That's also part of the value, because they're only looking at building a better board. They're not looking at build a better manufacturing company or bakery or whatever your business line is. Kieron, anything else? Otherwise, there's a couple
Tim, I think it probably reiterates a little bit of what has already been said, but I think there are 5 things. Number 1, get the composition of your board right. We've had lots of conversation about that. Make sure that you have a methodology in place that your board can follow. Make sure that your rhythm is there. And when I talk about rhythm, that your meetings are efficient, right from your secretarial functions to how you're dealing with minutes and agendas and everything else. Get the cadence right, and by cadence I mean frequency. If board meetings typically look at historical lagging information, and if you're only doing that once a quarter, so much time has passed on that old information that it may not be relevant anymore. So get your cadence or frequency right, and then evaluate. And as that's in the classics, rinse, repeat.
Good. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to my co-hosts for your contribution. I think it was a really, really interesting conversation, actually. And thank you for those who attended. Thank you for your engagement in the chat box. It's really good to see, and for your good questions. There will be a recording of this. It'll be shared with anyone who's registered. As I said, we'll send the summary slides as well, so you've got some idea of the detail and the specific numbers that we've said. Otherwise, please make sure you download the survey. It's available on our website. In fact, all of the surveys we've done are available on our website.
Thanks, everybody.
See, we're slightly over, so
Thanks, everyone.
Call it a day there. Thank you very much for spending your time with us. Cheers, guys.
Cheers, Tim. Thank you.